Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to today's History of Jehovah's Witnesses tour, and I'm happy to have here Gary with me. We will talk about Jehovah's Witnesses as we always do, but the interesting thing is we will talk not about the Second War as I mostly am talking about. No, with Gary we will talk about his book and about Jehovah's Witnesses in the First World War. That's something special. This is something special. First World War, Conscientious Objectors, and focus on Great Britain, not on Germany, as I normally do. So we think this will be 1 hour, something like that, right, Gary?
Yeah, fine, whatever.
If we will not stop talking, we will just keep talking. And after that, if you have questions, you're welcome to also ask some questions. So yes, welcome, Gary. Thank you to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And I'm happy that it works. And yeah, I showed already the book. Maybe I show it just for 1 second again on the screen, so the friends will also see this. Here we go. That's the book, Bible Student Conscientious Objectors in World War I in Britain. And yeah, we have some questions to you, Gary, and I would say let's start. Maybe first your background, what's your interest, who are you?
Well, I'm a brother like you'll find in most congregations. I think most congregations you have 1 or 2 brothers who have got a special interest in the history of the organisation. So I've always been fondly interested in that. That's our heritage, which is the word you used earlier. I was privileged a few years back in 1974 as a boy to read the yearbook, hear all the wonderful experiences of the brothers in Germany, and that amazed me. And then about 2000, I was kindly asked to help a little bit with the Stand Firm work in Britain. And that was a real joy to me because I got to meet 1 or 2 of the survivors who I'd read about previously. So that was an inspiration for me, as I know you feel the similar way, Tomek. So that that was such a joy to meet these ones, and so motivational.
I believe you. Yes, 74 yearbook. Yes, one of my favorites too. It's an amazing yearbook. And the Stand Firm, the video, and the it's called the exhibition, right? It's I think, as you said, when you experience that, you will never forget that, right? It's yeah. So as you said, pretty similar. That's cool. That's great. So you started your research, and yeah, you wrote that book. What caused you to research and write that book?
Well, it was a quote I read initially from a British peace studies scholar called Martin Keedle. You can show the quote if you like on the second slide there.
Yes.
And this is what he said. He said of Jehovah's Witnesses, he said, "We've had a leading role in refusing military service during the 20th century, but it has not received the recognition it deserved." Well, that was the part of the quote I liked. But then he went on to say the reason that was the case. He said, "This is because they have been too socially marginal to have left records of their collective experience." I didn't like the second bit. In a sense, I could see where he was coming from, though. In saying we're too socially marginal, I think we would use the word "we're no part of the world." And that's what makes us socially marginal to scholars. But he also said that he implied that we weren't terribly well educated. and that we haven't left records of their collective experience. So that set me a little bit of a challenge, really. I thought, well, there must be a record of Bible students, as the brothers were earlier called, in this country. There must be a record. And I wondered, is it possible to start collecting those experiences so as to present it to Professor Keedle? So that was the challenge, really, that was set for me. And then I got a fortunate break, some might call it, although I like to think that Jehovah helped me a great deal. I went on holiday with my two boys, who were just kids at the time, to Richmond in Yorkshire. And my wife and the boys loved history, and we went to see a Norman keep in Richmond, which you can show the brothers perhaps on the next slide. So this is going back to not long after 1066. You'll see the keep there. But strangely enough, it wasn't, well, that's what I went for, but it was this light building on the right-hand side that eventually captured my imagination, because this was a cell block that was added to the castle in the 19th century. And it's what went on in that cell block that really captured my imagination and got me going in collecting records of Bible students. With another brother, John Healy from Richmond, who knew a little bit about the story, so I could his information. And then we started collecting details of individual Bible students. We found over 420 eventually who had served as conscientious objectors, and we started to unravel their story, basically. So that's what it was all about.
Amazing, of more than 400. And yeah, we'll talk about this more later. But so you wrote that book, question for who? Who's written for?
Well, it's really written not for brothers and sisters, strangely enough, although a number have read it and enjoyed it and benefited from it, I like to think, and they tell me so. But it's really written for scholars and students of peace studies, so that they could understand why we made the stand we did. And when we researched originally, we wanted to gather the information, the collective experience, to use the professor's term, and then present it to scholars with the hope that they would run with it.
Mm-hmm.
And one very superb scholar, in fact, from Leeds University, called Cyril Pearce, had been doing a lot of work on conscientious objection in World War I as a whole. And I was hoping he would run with it. But he had a mammoth task that he was entering into, which was to collect data on 20,000 conscientious objectors in Britain. So he said that was taking all his time. And he said, why don't you write it? You understand the context and the background better than I do. Why don't you have a go? So that's how we came to put it together.
And thank you for that. So let's talk about these more than 400. If we think now about the First World War, we think about Britain, the kingdom. What sort of pressures these young men were fighting? Yeah,
if you think about the society as a whole, how it tried to mold young lives, it was quite significant, really. If you've been brought up in Britain, going to church regularly, being told to love your neighbour, saying your please and thank yous, all of a sudden there was a change, because Britain, as you know, got involved with the war, and all of a sudden it was not a matter of loving your enemies, it was a matter of going out and trying to finish them off. And so there was a huge propaganda machine designed to make young people do what the government thought was the right thing to do, which was to go to war. And there was a big worry in government circles that there could be a backlash against this. So maybe we could have a look at some of the posters that tried to prompt people to do the right things. Oh, by the way, just go back to that last one a minute. This is an inscription from one of those cells I just told you about at Richmond Castle. And the keen brothers and sisters might notice straight away some cross and crown symbols there that the early Bible students used to use.
Yeah.
And also they might notice a number of scriptural references from the Psalms. And in big bold in the middle, no man can serve, well, I'll leave you to fill in the rest. Two masters. No man can serve two masters. It was not possible to be serving the influence of the world and go to war and to be serving God at the same time. You either serve one or you serve the other, but not both. That's the message that our brothers were writing on this wall in Richmond Castle. So this was something, a lady, a kind lady for English heritage, let me see the cells. You can't normally see them. She let me inside, and I found it mind-boggling to be able to see these inscriptions from our early brothers. So what were the pressures they're under? Maybe you can go on now to the next slide. And you'll appreciate the propaganda posters of the country were very much geared on getting people to enlist in the army. Initially, unlike Germany, in Germany, as you know, all young men were sent into the army. In Britain, they wanted initially to have just a trained specialist force. And so they did all their best to get people to enlist voluntarily initially. And the way they did it was the famous Kitchener poster there, "Your country needs you." And also you'll see from the poster on the right, people were encouraged to take up the sword of justice. In other words, this was a war for righteousness. And if you went to fight it, they believed you were doing God's will in defeating the foe. Maybe you go on to the next slide. You can see the pressure here. Who's absent? Is it you? And be honest with yourself. Be certain that your so-called reason is not a selfish excuse. Enlist today. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that mothers, wives, and daughters were used to encourage war as well, because it was considered your duty, son, to go. And the women were very much positive that their man must go to war. And perhaps we move on to the next one. The idea here is to step into your place or stand out. Well, you can imagine to stand out took a lot of courage, as our brothers would have to do so. And our next one. Well, here's another thing. If you could miss out on the girl of your dreams if you didn't enlist. You get the cold shoulder, that's the inference. And then if you did marry the girl of your dreams, but you hadn't willingly enlisted, then what will you tell the children post-war? Well, that's assuming you survived post-war, of course. These were all posters, postcards, pictures in newspapers trying to propagate the ideas of the government at war. And we know this happened in every country. I'm sure it happened in Germany. I know it happened in America. It happens in every country because they believe that they are right. And therefore, they've got to make sure, having determined to go into battle, they've got to make sure that they win. And so this is part of the propaganda to get people on side.
But that's really crazy. If you just think about this, it's to use. So if you allow, I would like to go So that's, yeah. The Americans have the same, right? This
they copied that one. The Americans did. And they put Uncle Sam on it.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, as you said, this justice thing. So what kind of person are you if you don't fight for justice? So it makes you a bad person.
That's the inference, isn't it?
Absolutely crazy. For the left one is a little bit for me, how to say, so there's a fat politician telling me I have to go to war. So,
I'm not sure that would inspire me, but I think it's more a matter of bullying rather than anything else.
Yeah. But I think this is one of the most. And you say that the mothers really encourage the sons to go, or is it just propaganda?
Well, many of them did, because they thought that was the right thing to do, and it would bring shame on the family if they didn't. So it was propaganda perhaps that made them feel that way. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, having worked, that was the response.
Yeah. That's really sad. And also then here to use the children. I'm not sure if any children would be interested what the dad did in the war. But yeah, this propaganda stuff is really, it's really interesting. Propaganda.
Can I show you what sort of propaganda, what was the attitude toward conscientious objectors in terms of posters and postcards?
Yes, the next one.
If you want to move on.
Yes, please.
Now notice that this little piggy stayed at home. So this is the idea of a conscientious objector who's having an easy life at home while his father, brother, mother, sister, uncle and cousin are doing their bit for the war effort. So they're questioning the motives here of objectors. And if you go on to the next slides, this portrays non-combatant or non-combatant conscientious objectors. That would be those that decided to go into the war but not handle weapons, tidying up behind the scenes, as it were. And you'll notice that they're portrayed as being effeminate idiots. So, you know, they're out of their mind. They're softies. They're not real men, in other words. That was the image that society had of conscientious objectors. So with all that propaganda going around, it was quite a challenge for a young man who'd been brought up. It was a challenge for any young man to resist that, but especially so for young Bible students. And if you hadn't already dedicated your life to Jehovah, you were kind of in no man's land here, and you had to juggle and decide which way you were going to go. So it was a challenge. Maybe if we go on to the next slide, we can understand how the brothers were prepared by Jehovah to make such a stand. Because of course Brother Russell appreciated that 1914 would bring about a great time of distress, so that came true. And in 1914, the photodrama of creation prepared young Bible students effectively for what was going to be round the corner. In a number of tribunals, it was pointed out that the photodrama of creation had started the downslide of these young men who were wasters, because it was preparing them not to fight. And to a large extent, that was true, but of course they weren't wasters. So if we go on to our next slide, I'll give you an example of this. Now, these are the Leeds Ecclesia.
The congregation.
That's right. They're outside a building in Leeds, which is now the Leeds City Museum. We can date it within 3 or 4 days, the date of this picture, because we know when they were there. And there's a few characters in here you'll be seeing a little bit later. For instance, in the middle there, just above the young boy, you'll see Herbert Sr., very faithful brother, who's a bit of a hero for me, because I heard him give a talk as an old man when I was a young boy in Aldershot in Hampshire. But that's another story. But there's at least 4 or 5 young men here whose faces will appear in a few years' time, in a matter of less than 2 years' time, at the tribunals in Leeds. So maybe you can go on to the next slide, and we'll follow the story through.
Oh, there they are.
There are the pictures of the 5 Leeds men who eventually were sent to Richmond. Why were they different? Well, they had an international brotherhood, of course, albeit small. They anticipated in 1914 to be a time of trouble, and they knew they'd need to make some sort of a stand. They weren't afraid to be unpopular because they wore the cross and crown symbol. And the idea was, before you got your crown, you'd have had to be prepared to carry your cross. I would have put it in those days. Of course, we don't use that symbol now, thankfully.
But for that time, it helped them, right?
Yes, it did. It was right for that time.
For that time, yeah.
Yeah, just like the photodrama was right for that time. And the understanding of the Gentile times was right for that time.
Yes, absolutely.
And of course, they consider themselves citizens of God's kingdom and not of the British Empire. And so they acted as aliens and temporary residents when it came to commands that were out of keeping with Jehovah's specific requirements. They weren't rebels, of course. They weren't trying to defy the state. It was merely a matter of them obeying God rather than men, when there was a contradiction between the two. So there are the 5 young men. We'll meet them as we go along a little bit more. And if you want to go to the next slide, please, Tommy. This is just explaining some of the early thoughts of Charles Taze Russell on war. Back in 1896, he explained the attitude that we should have to war, using the same arguments as we would use today. The only thing is that early on, Brother Russell said that in the event of war, if we were conscripted, we would go into the army, but we shouldn't be prepared to fire guns at our fellow man, which is, of course, what happens to our brothers in Germany from 1914 onwards. They would go into the army, they wouldn't fight, or they wouldn't fire their weapons, but they would do other jobs of assistance, if you like, to the army without being involved in combatant work itself.
So you would say that's the difference between the Bible students in England and the Bible students in Germany at that time.
Well, there's one big difference, and this is all to do with timing. If you move on to the next slide. Oh, wait, I'd forgotten this was a slide. Here's an example of a German brother in the trenches.
This one?
It's Rudolf
Spanhof.
Yes, thank you for pronouncing that. He's reading studies in the scriptures while in the trenches during World War I. So you can appreciate he's involved in non-combatant work, non-combatant work. So he's not fighting, but nevertheless he was there. And that's because he was following Pastor Russell's advice that we just looked at. However, there's a big change here. If you go on to our next slide, there was a change in emphasis which occurred in the September 1915 Watchtower. And Brother Russell started to think about what was happening. And he said, we cannot tell how great the influence would be for peace and for righteousness and for God if a few hundred of the Lord's faithful were to follow the course of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and refuse to bow to the God of war. In other words, Brother Russell was now encouraging Bible students not to take on the army uniform. Now, he wasn't dogmatic about this, I have to say. He did understand that some did go into the army to help as medical orderlies, for instance, and he made a concession for them if their conscience allowed them to do it. But this was a change in emphasis now, where generally speaking, he was encouraging them not to take on the military uniform. And this was September 1915, and Britain, by the end of the year, of that year, was looking seriously at conscripting men, forcing them into the army. And by the 2nd of March 1916, that's exactly what they did do.
Oh, okay.
So this is why the stand of the brothers in Britain is slightly different than the stand of those in Germany, which had already started in 1914.
Yeah, that's because that's the thing. September 14, the Germans were already fighting.
Yeah, that's right. So if you go on to our next slide, you need to think now about what the expectations were of these Bible students. One of the scriptures in Matthew is where Jesus said, "You'll be delivered up to courts for my sake, for a witness to them and the nations." And of course, when the young brothers had to make a stand as conscientious objectors, they went before military service tribunals in Britain, which were big public events, and they had to explain why they felt they shouldn't fight. So this was an opportunity for them to witness. And they grasped the opportunity.
So how were exactly these trials like?
Well, they were quite daunting, because if you see the picture there, you would go before your town or city's dignitaries. These were usually men. There'd often be councillors there. There'd be a war representative. There'd often be a vicar there. The idea was to get you into the army, basically, unless you had a very good reason otherwise. And even if you had a very good reason otherwise, often you would be sent to the army anyway. So it was often a bit of a charade, because they were there to test or judge people's conscience, as it were. But in many instances, they'd already made the decision. So if you go on to our next slide, you can get a snippet of what happened when these 5 young men from Leeds went before their tribunal. Now, the tribunal in Leeds was held at the town hall in a big public gallery, and the public were allowed to go as well. And according to the newspapers, the gallery was full that day. And amongst the gallery, there were many Quakers. A lot of Quakers opposed the war. Some were involved in it, but there was a lot of Quakers opposed. And of course, there'd have been brothers and sisters from the Leeds congregation there as well. So if you have a look at the newspaper snippet there, it tells you that the tribunal, military service tribunal at Leeds, had a busy day yesterday with so many applicants. And it happens to mention many of them were conscientious objectors, and many of the objectors on religious grounds were members of the International Bible Students Association, and practically all were unmarried. Now, I find this hilarious, because at this point in time, they were only going before tribunal. They were only enlisting unmarried men at this point. Later on in the year, they enlisted married men as well. So it was obvious that they were all unmarried. So why bother mentioning it? I think they're trying to tell us in their own way that these men aren't very experienced. You know, they don't know what life's about. You know, they're just
young lads.
Yeah, that's it. That's
boys.
It. And you'll see there that it mentions the first applicant, a pale-faced young man, subjected the tribunal to a perfect volley of scriptural quotations, illustrating almost every sentence with chapter and verse. And he said he couldn't see any good reason why he should be involved in the war. So this was them using the opportunity to witness, and to witness to the important dignitaries of the city in this case. Now, who was that pale-faced young man? I don't know. But it could have been Roland Jackson, who's on the right here, pictured. He wrote a letter to the Watchtower in 1916. If you've got the old digital copies, you might be able to find that letter. Or it could have been Herbert Simpson, Herbert Senior rather, who's on the left-hand side. But one thing that did come up, which comes across from a newspaper report, at one point, the Herbert Senior was questioned, and the councillor said to him, well, what would happen? It would be chaos. If everybody had your attitude, we'd lose the war. And Herbert Senior said, if everyone was of my opinion, there will be no war at all. So
absolutely.
Now, when he made that statement, the whole of the gallery at Leeds Town Hall erupted in applause. Can you believe that?
Unbelievable.
The chairman of the tribunal wasn't very pleased, and he said, he tried to calm the crowd down. He said, if I have any more of this unruly behavior, you'll be kicked, the whole of the audience will be kicked out to the street, and we'll do it behind closed doors. He didn't like the way it was going.
Yeah, because he destroyed the whole argumentation, just one sentence, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just one sentence.
So to cut long story short, what happened to these men? Well, there's another comment from Senior, by the way. He said to me, there's no difference in principle in unloading shells and putting the shell into a gun to be fired for the killing of men. It's all part of the same process. So this is Senior saying, there's no point making me a non-combatant soldier in the army, because I'm not willing to do that either, because I might as well shoot the gun as help them load the gun.
And that in 1914 or 16. Amazing.
Yes, it is.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's understandable. It's pretty cool. This reminds me, I think it's in the last Watchtower that we studied, and there's the story of Brother Leon, forget the last name, that he was angry that Jehovah's Witnesses don't join the war. I think it was during Korea War, something like that. And the brother who studied with him said, hey, and really the same thing. He said, if no American would go to war, other countries would just take over America. And the brother said, if everybody in America would do what Jehovah wants, what do you think, what would Jehovah do?
You can't beat the logic, can you?
Yes, it is. It's absolutely. And the funny thing is, this is what I did at school to try also my colleague, my friends at school to explain the same. Hey, if everybody would be like us, what would Adolf Hitler do? Kill everybody? It's impossible. There will be no Nazi party.
Yes, the governments rely on the support of the people. And of course, if they were to follow the Sermon on the Mount, that they wouldn't have been involved in wars, would they? Whichever the country. So
peace on earth, surprisingly.
Yeah. Wouldn't like that, would they? So what happened to these men?